The United States is facing foreign policy challenges on multiple fronts, from places like Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. And with John Bolton now leaving the White House, there are huge questions about how we will confront all of these challenges. As we speak, we are waiting for President Trump to announce his new pick to become the fourth national security advisor in less than 3 years. That is more than any other first-term president in U.S. history. But while Bolton's departure illustrates the chaos and infighting of this administration, most Americans are probably going to let that slide as long as the president and his team are able to keep this country safe. I have a fantastic team here to break all of it down. Carol Lee has brand new exclusive reporting about how John Bolton's departure unfolded. Ben Rhodes served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. Nick Rasmussen was director of the National Counterterrorism Center under President Obama and President Trump. Before that, he served on President Bush's National Security Council, joining it less than 1 week after the 9/11 attacks. Ben, let's start with you. You have been very critical of the president's foreign policy, but at the end of the day, it has now been 18 years without another major attack on the United States. As long as that remains the case, do most Americans care about how many national security advisors the president goes through, or is it just about them staying safe?
Well, Stephanie, first of all, obviously the top priority for anybody sitting in any of the jobs that Nick and I had is keeping Americans safe. I think Americans also care, obviously, about whether or not we're immersed in wars overseas. Those have obviously become unpopular over the last 18 years with Afghanistan and then Iraq. And right now, it's that sense that we may be sliding in the direction of conflict with Iran, or that we're in an escalating trade war with China that really does hurt Americans at their pocketbooks, right? So even though we're not talking about terrorist attacks, we are talking about things that really matter. Issues of war and peace abroad, issues of how our global economy is going to be managed, issues of America's standing in the world. And I think Americans, one of the things we were so proud of after 9/11 is how the world rallied around us. And I think there is real concern about an America that is not respected in the same way as it has been in past years under this current administration. So there are real challenges that confront whoever occupies that job. And even though it may not occupy the attention of Americans every day, it matters that you have this level of dysfunction, this level of turnover, this fact that other countries don't even know who the key person is to call in the Trump administration at this point, given how much there's been this kind of revolving door there. So, again, I think this is a very uncertain time with many different balls in the air, many different international crises that have yet to be resolved, and a lack of clarity coming from this administration about how they're going to deal with those issues of ending a war in Afghanistan, of avoiding a war with Iran, and de-escalating a trade war with China.
There's also real threats and challenges that don't just come in the form of hijacked planes. Nick, you know better than I do. You've got cybersecurity. You've got disinformation campaigns. We have seen these issues real time over the last couple of years. So for those who argue we are safe, we haven't seen a 9/11 in 18 years, what do you say to them?
Well, I say a couple of things, Stephanie. One, I think our defenses are much stronger than they were at the time of 9/11. We are much more capable of defending ourselves, going on both the offense when necessary, but also the array of defensive measures we've erected in the Homeland Security enterprise since 9/11. But at the same time, as Ben points out, and as your question points out, that threat landscape that we face is a whole lot more complicated than it was at the time of 9/11. We're not just talking about a small handful of al-Qaeda operatives trying to penetrate the United States. We're talking about a Sunni jihadist element that grows in number year after year, and that we actually face 4 times as many global terrorists, you might say, as we did at the time of 9/11, according to a recent study done by CSIS. So, again, this speaks to what Ben pointed out about the dysfunction of our national security leadership at this particular moment in time. We have thus far not had that crisis moment in this administration, but I fear that if it comes, we won't be as well postured for that crisis moment as we should be.
Let's dig deeper into the president and John Bolton. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. His story on John Bolton is today's must-read front-page story. Peter, we have spent the last several years talking about whether the people around President Trump would keep him from acting on his worst instincts. But in this case, it was John Bolton, not the president, who is the one pushing for more conflict, not less. And I want to share what the president said about him back in May.
John is a He has strong views on things, but that's okay. I actually temper John, which is pretty amazing, isn't it? Nobody thought that was going to happen. I'm the one that tempers him, but that's okay.
John Bolton is absolutely a hawk. It's up to him. He'd take on the whole world at one time, okay?
So no matter what else you think about President Trump, does the president deserve credit, I guess you could say, for trying to keep us out of more wars, which John Bolton would be inclined to do the opposite? Peter?
Well, it's an interesting conundrum, right? Because you've got this president who speaks with great bellicosity about the world. Remember, it was just a couple of weeks ago, he said he could wipe out the entire country of Afghanistan, kill millions of people, basically contemplating genocide, although he said he didn't want to do that. He talks a big game. He talks an apocalyptic game, sometimes that would seem to be very scary, very rattling for the world. And yet at the same time, of course, he came into office promising to end America's overseas wars. And there's this, fundamental conflict in there between those two sort of elements of his political persona. John Bolton played to one side but not the other. His predecessors were trying to restrain him against being too hostile toward the outside world, against being hostile toward allies. John Bolton, on the other hand, was trying to restrain him in a different way. He was trying to restrain him from making what he saw anyway as bad agreements with the likes of North Korea, Iran, most recently the Taliban. So, this yin and yang of the president's foreign policy thinking has been reflected in the succession of national security advisors he's had, which is why I think we're paying attention to who might be the next one.
All right, Carol, then without John Bolton, who is the most influential foreign policy voice inside this administration now?
Well, Steph, I'd have to say President Trump. I mean, we've seen, and increasingly as he cycles through his national security staff and new people come in, he's increasingly, decided that he's taking control of it, that he sets the policy. And I think the message of John Bolton's departure is in part that aides who work for Trump either need to get on board or they can leave. And that, the thing that John Bolton did that ultimately was his undoing was not only did he not get on board, but he made that known publicly, and that was what really got under the president's skin because he felt like it was undermining his policy. If you're looking more broadly of who might be able to get in the president's ear on certain things to try to sort of shape where direction he's headed, it would be Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's well known as somebody who can get in the president's ear and perhaps shift him around the edges. However, Mike Pompeo is known as one of the biggest Iran hawks in Washington, and he's even having to get on board with a president who now says that he wants to sit down with the president of Iran without any preconditions. So again, that underscores that if anybody is setting the policy, it's President Trump, and certainly that's the message that President Trump wants to convey.
Well, yesterday, John Bolton certainly made his views known to our own Peter Alexander. Peter's at the White House. Peter, John Bolton reached out to you personally. What did he say?
Yeah, well, the bottom line is you're seeing the sort of contradiction in the stories that the two sides are telling. The takeaway here is that these two men who had disagreements on Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan couldn't even share a story in terms of the way things ended here. John Bolton, after the president said effectively that he fired Bolton on Monday night, texted me and he said that he offered to resign Monday night, that the president never directly or indirectly fired him, that ultimately he slept on it and that he resigned on Tuesday. So now we look forward and focus on the short list, in effect, of who could be the next national security advisor. Remember, President Trump now, in less than 3 years, is looking for his fourth national security advisor. We can show you some of the faces of those who are under consideration, according to people in and around this White House and some of the president's allies. Lindsey Graham, one of the president's allies, saying, for one, it'll have to be someone who is close with Mike Pompeo, who has an oversized role increasingly behind the scenes here. Rick Waddell, you see, he's a former deputy national security advisor. He left the White House after Bolton took the role. Brian Hook there on the screen, the U.S. special representative for Iran. He has one of those critical qualifications, which is that he's particularly close to Pompeo. Keith Kellogg, the national security advisor right now to the vice president, Mike Pence. He was the acting national security advisor for, I think, just 7 days after Mike Flynn was ousted early in the president's term. Tom Bossert, the former Homeland Security advisor to President Trump. We've reached out to him. He declined to comment. He stepped down about the same time that John Bolton was appointed. Those are some of the key names that we'll be focusing on as we go forward. But as Carol said so well, for the moment, Donald Trump's the one who's sort of driving this train.
All right, well, those are the who. How about what are they going to do? Ben, we know Bolton opposed the negotiations with Iran and the Taliban. Yes. With Bolton out, does it mean we're closer now to those things happening?
Well, absolutely. And, Stephanie, there's, the UN meetings later this month in New York City. And the Trump administration seems to be almost chasing a meeting with the Iranians. The Iranians have not indicated that they want to sit down bilaterally with President Trump, but he keeps making the point that he would like to sit down with the Iranians. And part of what we're seeing here is he's entering into an election year, Stephanie. He's got a lot of balls in the air, a lot of planes that need to land here. We've got Iran resuming its nuclear program. We've got North Korea still building new nuclear weapons. The war in Afghanistan is still ongoing, even though President Trump promised to bring it to an end. The China trade war is escalating. He wants to get some agreements somewhere to show that he's landing some of these planes. And Bolton obviously was ideologically resistant to those deals, be it with the Taliban, with North Korea, with Iran. The problem here, as Peter points out, though, is that Trump's own approach has been bellicose. The reason we're in a crisis with Iran is that Trump pulled out of the Iran deal and used a lot of belligerent rhetoric, and the Iranians responded. So the question is not just whether President Trump has an inclination to do this, but whether they have the competence to carry this out, whether they have the national security team that can design these kinds of agreements, and frankly, whether other countries will trust President Trump to keep any agreements he makes after he's pulled out of so many agreements that the United States has been a party to. So it's going to be a very complicated few months with very significant consequences, again, for matters of American national security and our economic well-being when you look at the China trade war.
Okay, then, Carol, then this takes us to your fascinating new reporting about who the president spoke to before he decided to let Bolton go. Tell us about this. Talking to H.R. McMaster, a guy who, in theory, the president didn't think had the competency to get the job done because he let him go before Bolton showed up.
Yeah, Steph, my colleagues, Courtney Kube and Kristen Welker and I have talked to people who said that, starting as soon as 6 months into John Bolton's tenure, the president started to call H.R. McMaster. And you recall, he left on very sort of unceremonious. He was unceremoniously fired as well. It was, disclosed on Twitter. And the relationship had really deteriorated. And so, last fall, he calls him and says, tells him he misses him. There's been calls since then where they've talked about Iran. He's, asked who he thinks he should name as defense secretary. And so it was kind of underscores two things. One is that obviously President Trump was his confidence in John Bolton was waning. He was questioning whether he should stay in the job or was kind of reaching out. And the other thing is that, no one ever really leaves Trump world, essentially. We've seen the president get rid of people and have a really bad relationship with them and then reach out to them later. We saw this with former Chief of Staff Reince Priebus when he was fired. And then John Kelly came in, and when John Kelly was trying to get him president to do things he didn't want to do, he started to call Reince Priebus. So it's kind of an interesting window into how the president sort of casts about as he becomes sort of restless with somebody who came in, as John Bolton did, with huge fanfare and was seen initially as a real favorite of the president's.
I don't know. Bolton could be leaving the president's world for good. Peter, John Bolton didn't just talk to Peter Alexander. He spoke to you yesterday as well. Given all the people who left the administration, but who haven't really, I don't know how to say it, spilled the beans or said much about what went on inside, do you think Bolton will be different? It's amazing that he was reaching out to so many reporters himself yesterday.
Well, I think he wanted to set the record straight as he saw it. I don't think he wanted to be, living under President Trump's narrative, which so many others who have left the White House have had to swallow. And so he decided to speak out, at least in terms of correcting what he saw as the mistaken description of how his departure happened. Look, we've seen in the last couple of weeks how Jim Mattis has handled things, right? Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, when he left, he did write a letter, pretty straightforward, saying, I don't think we agree, Mr. President, on how to handle allies and on issues like Syria. But then he's basically stayed quiet. He's got a new book out, and even in the new book refuses to criticize President Trump. I don't know that John Bolton is going to take that same path. He's a pretty outspoken guy. He says what he thinks. One thing he's known for is his bluntness, his candor. My guess is that at some point in the next few months, you might hear him give his point of view about things. That doesn't necessarily mean he'll become an outspoken critic. Doesn't mean he'll go off the team like Anthony Scaramucci did. But it's hard to imagine John Bolton not telling us what he thinks at some point when he's ready to.
So, Nick, what do you think we're going to get in the president's next pick? All along, he said how much he liked that John Bolton had an opposing view from him, but we know how that turned out from Bolton.
Well, Stephanie, some of those names that you threw up on the screen a couple of minutes ago will be individuals who know that their success in that role will only come if they align themselves almost completely and identically with the president's views going in. And that worries me a little bit, because obviously one of the primary responsibilities of a national security advisor is to bring options to the president, including options and views that fall outside of what the president wants to do and wants to hear. And obviously, there were a lot of doubts about John Bolton when he was named to the position about whether he would play that steward role fairly and consistently. So whoever comes in next will face a challenge in trying to align themselves to the president's views, while also trying to run a system that actually brings a full set of options to the president. That's the way the system is supposed to work.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.